Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design Workshop. Today we'll discuss slice of day near-term implementation. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the California ISO. I'm also joined by Partha Malvadkar, Principal for Resource Adequacy, and Ansel Lundberg, Policy Developer. We'll have several folks from the policy team joining us in the conference room throughout today's meeting. Also, as a reminder, the presentation for this meeting is posted on the Policy Initiative webpage under the Stay Informed tab. Next slide, please. Before we get started today, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We hope these workshops are informative and collaborative and that they stimulate some open dialogue and engage different perspectives, but we do ask that you keep your comments professional and respectful. Next slide. If you do have a question or want to make a comment today, there's a few ways to do so. So if you're connected through your audio and using your computer or using the Call Me option through the WebEx platform, you can click the raise hand icon in the bottom toolbar. If you're joining us through an audio-only line, you can click #2, and that'll add you to the queue. And then if you prefer, you can put your question or comment into the chat, and I will read it aloud for you. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. And if you run into any technical difficulties today, you can send a chat to event producer, and they'll help you out. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it over to Partha now to walk us through a bit of the details for today's discussion.
Sure, thanks Caitlin. And yeah, thanks everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to meet today to discuss how we plan to have the CPUC slice a day values work with our RA systems and processes. I'd note that we received significant feedback from participants in our Resource Adequacy Working Group process, particularly requesting that the ISO provide additional clarity as well as the opportunity for discussion on the business and commercial impacts of these changes. So, we're really here today to move forward in meeting those objectives. So I'd also like to note that this workshop really builds off of the presentation that Christy Sonata gave at the CPUC workshop previously on sharing our ideas on how slice a day could function in our program, as well as the workshop last summer that Anya Gilbert led on our plan for the 2024 CPUC slice a day test year. So today our policy lead, Ansel Lundberg, will be leading the discussion here in the room with support from Christy Sonata, Eric Larquist, Alice Kilduff, Callan Mixa, and we have a remote from Turkey, Abdul Muhammad Ali. So yeah, really, Ansel's going to walk through how CAISO sees our process working in alignment with the CPUC Slice a Day and LRA programs. But yeah, I'd also note that we, while, just to maybe level set for this discussion, while we don't intend to make system and process changes for 2024, we really are open to sort of larger discussions for future changes in our RA working groups on both on the timing and the need for changes to our programs and processes. Foundationally, here our design is really continues to build off our role of translating LRA showings and ensuring for our role that our role in maintaining reliability built off the LRA procedures works effectively. So, finally, I'd really like to thank the CPUC Energy Division staff for their continued partnership in this effort. We've had numerous offline meetings to make sure that we're aligned from an implementation standpoint and have a common understanding on the commercial and program impacts of this implementation plan. So I really want to thank them for their time and their hard work in this effort on this front. With that, look forward to the discussion today, and I'll turn it over to Ansel to kick off the presentation. So yeah, thanks Ansel.
Thanks, Partha. Good morning, everyone. I'm looking forward to having this discussion today and hopefully clarifying some questions that you may have and providing some space for discussion about some of these topics around slice of day alignment with CAISO's RA systems and processes. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so this is an overview of what we're going to be discussing today. We have 2 hours here, so there's some material to cover. We're going to be discussing a brief overview of slice of day and the structure of that new resource adequacy process at the CPUC, just to bring everyone up to speed. We'll also then discuss the CPUC's new resource counting rules and how those interact with the showings process at the CPUC, but mainly at the California ISO. And then we'll move into touching on some of our processes at the ISO and how those function under slice of day. There's a list there, kind of some of our key processes that might raise questions about how those work with the new slice of day rules. And then finally, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about where we'll go from here in the working groups process and kind of what our plans are in the coming year for slice of day implementation. I also want to call back to the June 2023 workshop at slice of day that Partha mentioned. There's a robust overview of slice of day. If you'd like to get a little bit more in depth, I recommend you take a look at the recording there, but we'll continue to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page and we can answer questions as needed. So today it'll be about answering kind of frequently asked questions, but we are collaborating with our stakeholders here and the CPUC, as Partha mentioned, to figure out what steps we need to take, if any, to incorporate this new RA program into our processes. All right, next slide, please. Next slide again. All right, so I've actually covered this, so we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so again, we're going to have an overview of slice of day just to get everyone up to speed, cover some of the key points of the CPUC's new program, and so that we can level set for understanding how the ISO's processes work in tandem. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a graphic from that June 2023 workshop that was presented by actually PG&E presented an overview of slice of day, and so this is just a visual for reference, but to go back in time a little bit, CPUC adopted slice of day as their new resource adequacy framework in a decision in 2022, and this was, of course, the result of multiple rounds of workshops and work to reevaluate their RA framework implemented in 2006. And then a decision this year, they adopted additional program details, and they also set a schedule for the 2024 test year, which is occurring right now, and then a full transition expected to slice of day in 2025 RA year. I will note, you know, this is probably common knowledge, but the CPUC is one of dozens of local regulatory authorities that function within the CAISO BAA. However, of course, they are the largest by load share, about 90%, and so that's why we've received many questions about kind of the interaction between this program and our RA programs. So under this new slice of day framework, the CPUC's RA program will shift from this single capacity check in the coincident peak, so that's the peak across all LSEs, in the peak demand hour, to a capacity check in every hour of the day. So there will be 24 slices of the day in which capacity and thus energy will be checked. So the CPUC will still assess the program compliance on a monthly basis and will continue to require year-ahead resource adequacy showings. The key difference, I would say, with slice of day is that it provides a methodology to check storage charging sufficiency by adding battery charging to the hourly demand requirement. So in the graphic, you can actually see There's an example of storage is the gray area, and that can be shown in different hours of the day to demonstrate compliance with the CPUC's 24-hour showings process. In addition to the storage accounting methodology, there's also counting rules for certain resources that have changed under slice of day at the CPUC. So capacity counting for variable energy resources such as wind and solar will transition from eligible load carrying capacity to exceedance values. I'll get more into that in a future slide, and we'll touch on kind of what that means for showings and for the obligations for those resources. The decision where CPUC adopted the slice of day framework, they initially determined that they would find a single planning reserve margin across all hours by translating an LOLE tested portfolio to slice of day counting. So that is kind of in process right now at the CPUC, and we're in tune with that process to provide input and make sure we understand their process there. So for the test year, they did determine that they will move forward with a single annual PRM across all slices of all months of the year. So there are workshops taking place around that right now at the CPUC, so I encourage you to tune in if you'd like to learn more there. That concludes my kind of high-level summary of slice of day and the framework at the CPUC. I think I can pause right now for questions. If there are clarifications needed, I'd be happy to entertain those. So,
just a reminder, you can click the raise hand icon in the bottom toolbar to raise your hand, or if you're on audio only, just click #2. I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time.
All right, excellent. So let's now talk a little bit about the new resource counting rules and how showings work with those rules at the ISO's RA program and the CPUC. Next slide, please. And next slide again. Great. So we have an overview here of qualifying capacity. So I'm going to start with this kind of to make sure we're on the same page as far as how the ISO receives qualifying capacity numbers from our various LRAs, and particularly the CPUC. I will note also we've got a couple examples coming up that I hope will be helpful. That was kind of something we talked about at the June workshop. Stakeholders asked about a few particular examples for specific resource types, and we're going to go over those to make sure we have kind of a visual understanding of the showing process. So just to summarize here, under our tariff at the ISO, we defer to the various local regulatory authorities to establish qualifying capacity criteria for how resources should be counted as resource adequacy under those LRA programs. So as happens today, we receive those QC values from the LRAs, and that is an input to our process for our RA showings process. We'll also have a table in the next slide about some of the changes, summarizing from current use at CPUC and slice of day versus how they work with our showings process. So under slice of day, as I mentioned earlier, there's a shift for wind and solar and variable energy resources for their counting methodologies from eligible load carrying capacity to an exceedance-based approach. And the CPUC did decide that the QC values that they'll transmit to us at the CAISO for these resources will be based on the monthly gross peak hour. And as far as storage, which I was speaking to a little bit before, The counting methodology actually won't change, but how the storage resources are shown in the CPUC will be changing, as you saw a little preview in that graphic. So the CPUC has their own rules for how resources can qualify for RA, and that includes that they must be able to operate for 4 or more consecutive hours. So you hear me say 4-hour RA value, that's a reference to this requirement. And just to kind of level set, the QC value that the CPUC provides us is a megawatt level at which a battery or storage resource can discharge for 4 hours. So that's explicit rule there. And then dispatchable and non-dispatchable resource QCs will not be changing under slice of day. Next slide, please. So here's, this is a summary of kind of what I discussed in the last slide. So you have the resource type on the left. The second column is the CPUC's counting methodology and how it's changing under slice of day in the test year. And there's more information about how the resource is shown across the 24 hours at the CPUC, and then a summary of what we receive at the ISO for the QC values from the CPUC. And I'll highlight here, the first row is what we just discussed about variable energy resources, and the second row goes over storage resources. See, we have a question from Callie Wells from Gridwell.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTS. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I had a quick question on your storage example there. So you said that the PUC is going to transmit to the CAISO the maximum, essentially the PMAX, the maximum amount that a battery storage resource can discharge to, assuming it's a 4-hour battery. But even though the 24-hour slice a day showings might have that discharge capability spread out across several hours, it's something lower. Now, have you guys thought through what happens if a storage resource is contracted out to multiple entities, and so the total amount that they are showing for their slice of day to the PUC might be a fraction of the discharge capacity?
We do have a slide for this in a future example, but I don't know, Christy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, it's like it works today, right? So if a battery is partially contracted, we'd still show the 4-hour value of the storage relative to the NQC, so 50% contracted. For example, like a 10 megawatt, 40 megawatt hour battery, if one LSB had 50% of the resource, we'd show 10 or 5 to us, just 50% of that 4-hour value.
Okay, great. I just was curious if they're making sure that was going to get taken into account and not potential double counting on your guys' end. If, you know, one battery was contracted out to like 4 different parties, you weren't going to get 4 times the amount of capacity on your end. Okay, thank you. And sorry for jumping ahead. I don't have the slides right in front of me, so I didn't notice that you guys had that coming up.
No worries. We haven't gotten to it yet, so thank you, Callie. Thanks, Christy. All right. Yes.
We do have another hand raised question in the chat. If you wanna, do you want to pause for Q&A or just wrap up the slide?
Yeah, we could take Scott's question.
All right, Scott Olson.
Great, thank you. This is Scott Olson with Avangrid Renewables. Just want to confirm for wind and solar, you'll be looking at the gross peak hour, not the net peak hour. And if those gross peak hours will be defined in advance for each month by the CEC, or is there another approach you'll be taking for defining specifically what the hour is you'll be looking at?
I mean, so the CEC does set the demand forecast, but if you look at the PUC's master resource database tools, they do highlight the coincident gross peak hour for each month. Does that help?
Just to be clear, this is Calvin. Yeah, so we're not taking that number from the among the 24 numbers, the PUC gives that number directly to us. So it's the PUC who goes through their assessments and picks the correct hour and gives that number to us directly.
Thanks, Carolyn. All right. I see we have a question from Amy Wong from SoCal Edison in the chat. It says, where do demand response credits fit in?
At the CPUC showing, so yeah, it's so sure.
Yeah.
Amy, are you willing to call in and clarify sort of your question?
Yeah, Amy, her hand's raised, so can we unmute her line?
From Southern California Edison, thanks. Yeah, it was on the previous slide, or a couple slides back, where you were showing the various resources under the slice of day framework. So I just didn't see DR on there and just wanted to know where it fit in that aspect, as those credits are given from the CPUC to the ISO.
Yeah, so are you, the slide that we have before, it was for the 24 slices. If you're asking for credits regarding the 24 slices, the PUC, you need to ask the PUC that. PUC will be transmitting a single value credit to the ISO, as it always does. PUC will establish that value and will transmit that value to the ISO. We will be using that value for the credit. The PUC transmits to us.
And that will then, as this slide that you're showing then, will just be based upon the gross peak hour, the coincident gross peak hour, is that correct?
I'll confirm that with the CC, but yeah.
Thanks, Catalin. All right, I see Perry Servideo has a question, and then we can just go ahead and move on so we can get to some of the examples.
Perry Servideo, CISA. I just had a clarifying question on the wind and solar. So you're noting here that the CPUC moved to an exceedance value, and then you also are noting that the QC value that the CAISO is going to get is the monthly coincident gross peak hour. I just want to confirm, it's a two-part question. First is that you're saying that you're now going to be counting the QC as the exceedance as well, as opposed to the ELCC. Is that understanding correct?
Perry, can you rephrase that question?
How will the CAISO see the QC of a wind and solar? Is it essentially an exceedance value, or it will be the ELCC like today?
The QC value is whatever is provided by the PUC to the ISO.
Great.
The PUC uses a method to establish that. We just use the number the PUC provides to us.
Great. Okay, so that means you'll now be seeing an exceedance value rather than an ELCC value. Do you have a slide later where you're walking through your CPM decisions and how this change may impact the CPM decision?
Yeah, we can discuss that. We have a slide there about that.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
We'll get
yeah, because that's one sort of big change that I see there. Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks, Perry. Yeah, I think the examples will be helpful there, so thanks, Calvin.
Okay, I'll hold off. Thanks.
I said I was going to move on, but I do want to see Simone. I see your hands up. Simone Brandt from the PUC. If you want to chime in.
Clarify, to answer Perry's question, we'll be using the exceedance values for solar and wind, but the one value that will be the NQC value that's sent to CAISO is the hour of the day for that month where the load forecast peak is.
Thanks, Simone. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I just wanted to put this example showing up front. This is similar to a graphic that you may have seen from other ISO presentations about slice of day, and it's going to be kind of the root of a couple of these examples that we're going to discuss. So I'm not going to get into it right now, but this is an illustrative example that will help us understand some of these questions that we're hearing from stakeholders. So next slide, please. We're going to touch on the storage example and clarify a few things here. Next slide. All right. So this is an example that's going to help us kind of understand how batteries can be shown at the CPUC versus how they should be shown to the ISO. So in this example, if you see the navy blue in the morning hours on the left, that's battery 2. You'll see it's also shown in a couple other evening hours. And then the light blue is battery 1, and that's shown during the evening hours at the CPUC. So you'll see also that the battery 1 is shown in 4 hours, but you actually have battery 2 being shown across more than 4 hours. So if we look at the chart, which is representative of those values in a graph, it just corresponds. You have battery 1 has an 80 megawatt hour energy volume, and its 4-hour RA value is 20 megawatts. And then battery 2 has a 5 megawatt 4-hour RA value and an energy volume of 20 megawatt hours. So you'll see here, we've been talking about the gross peak hour, and so this year it's going to be, the CPUC has designated hour 19 as that hour. So you'll see that battery 1 is shown at 20 megawatts during that hour, but battery 2 is not shown during that hour. Next slide, please. This just highlights that peak hour. So this is, again, showings at the CPUC. So if we're talking about showings at the ISO, we have received a few questions about this, just making sure folks understand what that looks like. So next slide. So when showing these two batteries to the ISO, the first battery will be shown at 20 megawatts, which will be the QC value that we receive from the CPUC, and battery 2 will be shown at 5 megawatts. And that's regardless of the fact that it's not shown in hour 19. So this is just trying to kind of clarify that a battery may be shown in certain ways across the 24 slices of each month to the CPUC, but when showing to the ISO, we still need suppliers and LSEs to be showing that QC value, or up to the NQC value, I should say, regardless of how it's shown to the CPUC. And that's even including the test year in 2024, as well as implementation year in 2025. And then, Callie, you had the question earlier about partial contracting. So if a resource is contracted for less than the full amount, up to the NQC, so for example, battery 1, like Christy was saying, if it was sold, sort of half of it was sold to one LSE, then that would be shown at 10 megawatts, and that's what should be shown by the supplier and the LSE, the resource owner and the LSE. And that's, again, regardless of how it's shown at the Public Utilities Commission. So I hope that was helpful. We got some questions about this in the past, and so I think this is a helpful example for kind of understanding visually how that process works. So generally, again, just highlighting that no resource should be shown higher than the NQC value, even if it's partially contracted. So I'm going to pause there. I think we have some questions. We'll start with David McMillan.
David McMillan with Megawatt Storage. On slide 17, how do you show the duration of the battery? Because part of the intent here was to support longer duration batteries and not have RA nailed to a 4-hour only model for batteries. So if you had a 6 or an 8-hour battery, how does that get communicated? Because it looks like this is just operating under an assumption of 4 hours. In fact, I would recommend that when you do these examples, you include things like a 6 or an 8-hour battery, just to make it clear how this percolates through between the different organizations.
This is Catalin. It really doesn't matter how many hours the battery can operate. Each battery has a QC value that was established by the CPUC. So if you purchase that entire battery, you need to make a showing with the entire battery, with the entire NQC value. If you purchase 50% of that battery, you need to make a showing with 50% of that NQC value, regardless what that QC value is or how many hours the battery has behind it.
So how does the CPU, how does CAISO know if battery 2 is a 6-hour battery, that it's a 6-hour battery at 5 megawatts rather than a 4-hour battery at 5 megawatts?
So
I mean, this is just an example, and if you look at the PUC's showing tool, it will kind of optimize the dispatch of storage across an LSC showing, and so, I mean, this is just a very simplified example of that, and so, yeah, so we're just kind of mimicking what might happen in a PUC showing, which does kind of optimize discharge to help LSCs meet their slice of day compliance levels. But yeah, go ahead, Catalin, if you want to add anything.
So basically, you can dispatch that battery any way you like in the CPUC showings. To be clear, we're not getting the CPU showing at the ISO. All we're getting is the resource that's under the contract up to the NQC value. ISO knows from our master file how many megawatt hour each resource is good for. So if the resource was sold for 100% of its NQC value, the entire resource will have must offer obligation in the ISO markets. The ISO markets knows how big of the resource it is. It knows everything about its dispatch. So we know the characteristics of each one of these resources in the ISO markets. We have them from the master file.
All right. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and go to Noah Tong with MRP.
Noah Tong from Middle River Power. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Thanks, Noah.
Great. So I think along the same lines is what David just mentioned. You know, if you go back one slide on slide 16, I'm trying to bridge the gaps here in understanding. It's simply not like on a duration basis from the PUC with regards to the sort of the 2024 test year. You're not going to get a 20 megawatt hour showing to the ISO. You're going to get a 5 megawatt value. But I'm wondering how the PUC sort of calculates this value, because the optimization function within the slice of day templates, you know, yields this sort of curve, if you will. I don't know, this discharge profile. And is it, or maybe Simone can help it whether or not it's based on this hour ending 7 value, or is simply just sort of the total divided by 4 with regards to, you know, megawatt hours divided by 4 hours. Then that's how the PUC will send over to the ISO this 5 megawatt value.
So yeah, so Noah.
Oh, go ahead, Christine.
Oh yeah, Abdul, if you want to jump in, but I don't know if Simone, if you want to jump in and help clarify too, but the PUC will pass to us essentially the 4-hour value of the storage resources, how they, you know, those resources can qualify for RA today under the PUC's counting rules. So it would be the 4-hour valuation. But go ahead, Abdul. Sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, don't worry. Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Basically, for the purpose of CAISO, you know, don't look at that graph on the left side. That's a PUC, how it's going to look at the PUC side, the showings. But for the purpose of CAISO, it's still a single value. The PUC will continue to send us a single QC value for batteries is based on the 4-hour continuous output of the battery. You know, to David's point, whether it's 6-hour battery, 8-hour battery, they're going to find out what is this 4-hour continuous output, send that to us as they do today, single value. And that value is what, you know, after we take a 2-hour test to develop the NQC, then we get that single NQC value, and then that value is the basis for what the LSCs and the suppliers show us. If the resource is fully contracted, then that full value is expected to be shown to the CAISO, regardless of how it's shown on which slice it's being shown, how it's being optimized in the slice of day showings. That doesn't matter for the CAISO. For the CAISO is show me that single value based on the contracted amount, you know, based on NQC, and then we will optimize it in the market and dispatch it as we see, as you know, per hour market dispatch and real time and day ahead need basis. Does that make sense, Noah?
Yes. Let me just pause slightly just in case Simone wants to jump in.
Simone, if you do want to speak, just raise your hand and we'll unmute your line.
We can hold off on that, Simone. Feel free to raise your hand if you'd like, but thanks, Noah. No, is that helpful?
Yeah, that's helpful. I think it's also somewhat confusing because, you know, Abdul is telling me to sort of ignore the left hand graph or essentially the hour, the table with the hours, but then at the same time, you know, I have to figure out what sort of the LSC is showing it for, and they may or may not show the entire amount of capacity that was contracted, you know, due to different reasons, right? And so I'm just trying to get a better understanding, one, for purposes of the PUC showing and what PUC is sending to the ISO, whether the value of 5 megawatt here is coming from the LSC showing tab or coming from some calculation after the LSC showing complete tab.
Yeah, Noah, this is Catalin. I can probably solve that problem for you. The QC value is established way before the showing. The QC value, it is the megawatt hour of the resource divided by 4, limited by their Pmax. You can never exceed your Pmax, but it is the megawatt hour the resource is good for divided by 4, you know, limited by the Pmax of that resource. So that's how QC is established. Then the LSE can take that resource and spread it however they want to in the PUC 24-hour showings. And then if they use it as RA, then they need to make a corresponding showing to the ISO on a totally different template up to the QC value. So if they purchase 100% of that resource, they need to make a 100% showing with the QC value for that resource that's established at the ISO, which is the one we talked before. It's a single value.
Yeah, this is Simone. I think what Catalin just said is very important, right? So the amount that's shown in each hour is limited by the Pmax or the interconnection, right? So in these cases, it's going to be 20 or 5, but, you know, it can be spread out. And, you know, if these batteries could cycle more than once per day, you could show it twice, provided you show the charging sufficiency between each cycle. But what is entered on the LSE tab, if these LSEs have the entire battery, is that 20 and 5 for these 2 batteries. And no matter what the profile ends up being, whether you use the optimization or the default profile, which would look like battery 1 on a default profile, you're still showing the same NQC that you're showing today, which is what's on the bottom of this chart.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Simone and Noah. think we can go to Michael Kramick. Looks like Michael's put his hand down. Let's go to Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Servideo, CISA. I think that the point that Noah might have been getting to on that last one would be, first you can illustrate what you're showing by saying, assume that this battery 1 was instead shown over 6 hours rather than 4. You'd see lower showing values, but I think what the CAISO is saying, they're expecting to still see the supply plan with 20 megawatts on it, regardless of how it's shown on the LSE showing tab. That would illustrate and kind of put that to bed. But I think what Noah is going the next step further to say, this is a change from today, where an LSE or a supplier could choose to show a lower amount than the contracted value to the CAISO. So the example is yes, 20 megawatts is contracted, but perhaps the LSE only needed to show 10 of it. The LSE today could show 10 on their plan, even though the contracted value is 20. The supplier could also show 10 on their plan, and everybody meets their requirements. I think what I'm hearing now is that option to do that no longer exists, and batteries are treated sort of by CAISO are treated more as if they were solar or wind, where the shown value is much less. However, you're basically fully committed with the must offer to CAISO. Am I interpreting that right?
No, yeah, that's not, yeah, we're not forcing you to show something beyond what you would want to. So that's not changing. I think what we're saying here, though, is if, you know, we kind of get that partially contracted example. So if you're only contracted with half of this battery 1, then if you only wanted to show 10 and 40 megawatt hours at the PUC, then you don't have to show 20 to the CAISO, you just show 10. But I think what we're really trying to hone in is like on your first point. You know, the first point, yes, that's right. We're, you know, regardless of how the resource is shown to the CPUC, we would still want that 4-hour value, but that doesn't mean that you're forced to show anything above what you're contracted for.
Yeah, it gets, okay, just to knit on just that last point above what you're contracted for is, you could be contracted for say 20, but you agree with the LSE that, hey, we're only going to show 10 this month. There might be a good reason why, and they work that out sort of bilaterally. Where I'm trying to get to is in reviewing, and maybe Simone can help with this too, in reviewing the LSERA plan templates, the new ones for the LSEs at the CPUC, and now seeing this treatment here, what I'm missing is I don't think I have this option anymore to make an agreement with the LSE and show 10 megawatts less than contract.
Terry, this is Abdul. You do have the option. It's just what we're saying. It's really up to 20 megawatts in this example. So that battery, you know, it's a 20 megawatt battery NQC. If you contracted 20, but for some reason the EU and the LSE said, let's just do 10, maybe the LSEs met their obligation, and you agreed, hey, I'm going to keep some for substitution, whatever. You have an agreement between you and the LSE, and you said 10 is enough, that's fine. What we're saying, if you're showing the 20 in slices, in off-peak slices, or, you know, like in battery 2 here in this example, off-peak slices, on-peak slices, it doesn't matter for the CAISO. Show us that single value that you contracted up to NQC, and that value is based on NQC, and it's up to NQC, up to contracted amounts. If you want to show less, as you do today, you can do that. That's fine. Just don't worry about the megawatts being in different slices. That's what we're trying to say.
Okay. No. Yeah. And that much is clear.
Basically, Perry, it's really up to that. The LSC has an obligation to meet an obligation to meet, and show us what you want to meet your obligation with. That's how we're going to account it. It's based on NQC as it is today. if you want to show a slice, that's fine, but watch out for obligation. You probably don't want to be deficient. So that's what we're saying. It's just we're setting upper boundaries, and we're saying don't worry about the slices. It's still a single value for CAISO, but we're not forcing you to show the full contracted value.
Yeah, I get it. At least from CAISO's template standpoint, you'd be able to put in whatever values you want. I was more getting to, I don't see a way to represent that on the CPUC's showing. So if you're gonna, being that your input data will be directly from the LSC and the supplier, maybe there's not a problem, but perhaps in the test year here, you might have a problem sort of interpreting the CPUC's information because you're more than likely going to see the full contracted value. I hadn't seen a spot on the LSCRA plan from CPUC where you could put sort of a shown value other than this exact tab that you're showing us here.
And maybe that's a PUC question, Perry, but I think for us, hopefully we're clear in what we need and what we're going to use.
Right.
But that's a fair question, maybe a PUC question. Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Abdul. Thanks, Perry. Okay, let's go to Rahul and then Mary.
This is Rahul Kalaskar from AES. Can someone confirm you can hear me?
It's a little quiet, but yes.
So my question is, all of this discussion is related to QC and what's shown on the LSC plan. The must offer obligation and the RAIM rules for RA, I'm assuming there is no change, but is there a point, at some point that CAISO is planning to do a review of those rules and how something may be changing, or in certain boundary cases, what may be the impact on those rules?
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. So we'll get into those processes a little bit more at the end of the presentation, but you're correct. Those processes are based on shown RA to the CAISO. So.
And there are no changes right now.
Yes.
Changes in the future will be discussed through the stakeholder process.
Okay, so if you can take this for your future, slides, is what's the difference in the RA obligation for 4 hours versus 8 hours? You don't have to answer now, but those are the kind of things would be good to know. And if it's already included in the slide, I'll wait for that.
The obligation is 24-hour obligation. If you sold RA, you have a 24-hour obligation.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Mary?
I just had a couple clarifying questions. I wanted to go back to the topic about the duration of the battery and for longer durations, and you mentioned using the CAISO master file to understand what the actual duration is. I just want to confirm that that would get incorporated into LOLE modeling of the RA fleet so that you would actually use the actual duration and not just take these numbers and assume it's all 4 hours, these capacity values.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're asking if we would use the showings in the PUC, I don't think we would, use the way that the resources are shown at the CPUC in our modeling. But yeah, we would make assumptions about, the duration of the underlying storage fleet.
Based on the master file?
Like TBD, where the source comes from. I know our master file parameters are confidential. But, in the master resource database, the PUC has placeholders for duration as well. So, yeah, TBD on what exactly we use or what source we pulled from.
Okay, so I might need to follow up on that.
Definitely. We'll have a more in-depth modeling discussion as well at our next working group meeting. So continuing that discussion from last week.
And then my other question is, for, let's say you have a 2-hour battery, would you be able to show that at the CAISO for any QC? Or does it have to be at least 4?
The 1-hour battery can be shown too. So it's an equivalent, it's the megawatt hour of the resource divided by 4 limited by the PMAX. That's a PUC ruling. That's what gets transmitted to the ISO. Once you have a QC established, based on that, how much you sold, if you sold your entire unit, you need to show that entire QC value. If you sold 50% of that unit, you need to show 50% of that QC value, whatever that is. And yes, we do have very few resources today. As a 1 hour resource, we have a few as 2 hours. The great majority are 4 hour resources, but we do have a few that are shorter than that, so their QC are less than their PMAX. Yet you still need to be able to make a showing at the ISO with vis-a-vis their QC value.
Okay, so you can show them at a amount less than the PMAX, but when we do the slice of day showing, you could still show, say, the 1 hour battery at the PMAX value for one slice.
It's a question for Simone.
Thanks, Mary.
Okay, well, if Simone, if she heard my question and can clarify, that would be great, but I will, I can also ask her at some other time. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Carrie at WPTF.
Can you guys hear me?
We can.
Oh, okay, great. So I had a quick process question. It sounds like you're going to be asking for different showing, I would say, I guess, processes. But I thought at the beginning of the call, you said you weren't making any changes. And it seems like at a minimum, these will need a BPM change. So can you just clarify whether you meant like no optimization changes, but there'll be BPM changes, or the plan going forward for this kind of slice of day scope for 2024?
Yes, thanks, Carrie. You're correct. We're not seeing any changes needed right now. Ketelin?
There are no tariff changes. There are no BPM changes. You just have to make a showing up to your QC value. Your LRA establishes the QC value. Yes, the PUC has changed the QC value for a couple of technologies here, but that they've actually, PUC has changed QC calculations 3 times in the last 5 years. So there is no BPM required changes, and there is no tariff required changes.
Thanks, Carrie. All right, we've got a couple more questions. We're kind of close to halfway through our time, so I want to make sure we get through the material. But let's go to Ian White.
Ian White here. Can you hear me?
We can, Ian. Thanks.
Okay, Ian from Shell here. This is a question/comment. In the future, it would be very helpful if we could distill some of this conversation and show it on the slides with, say, a calculation or something. Because when I go back and refer to these as notes, the notes are very much audio. And so just in the future, that would be helpful for me. And so, yeah, I would just ask that if we could distill what we just talked about a little more clearly as to how we got to that 20 megawatt QC, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. We'll take that into consideration here. I think the CPUC does have lots of helpful materials on these questions, but I appreciate that. All right, let's go to Michael Kremick.
You guys hear me?
We can.
Just I guess maybe a simple question, but what does the RA supply plan look like in the future? Does it change today? Or, for example, am I still putting, if I sold that full 20 megawatts to one LSE, am I still reporting one row in the supply plan, 20 megawatts, either system or local, and then potentially flex? Is that changing under this new construct, or will the ISO be a new supply plan?
Nothing changes on your supply plan, at least not for the foreseeable future, not for the test year, not for the foreseeable, nothing changes.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to confirm. Thank you much.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Catlin. All right, let's go to Matthew Haley and then David one more time, and then we'll go ahead and move on here.
I think the answer to this question is going to be that it's 20 megawatts, but I just wanted to clarify. You mentioned if the storage resource is shown for, I guess, 2 cycles in a day. If I look at sort of this battery 1, it would occur to me that it would show 20 megawatts 4 more times, and then the 4-hour RA value is going to be higher. I'm assuming that's not the intention, but just wanted to confirm if it's decided to be shown twice in one as a 2 cycle in 1 day asset, how that would be calculated.
So it would still
I mean,
be
the
20
NQC would
megawatts.
still be 20 megawatts, even if it's dispatched twice.
Right.
Thanks, Simone. That's perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. All right. And we'll go to David.
As you can see from the number of questions about duration, it would be very helpful when you work through these examples if you include either a 6 or an 8-hour battery, and also mention what happens with shorter than 4-hour durations. That, I think, is also important in coordination between the different agencies and also within your people internally, just because we are making a move here from 4-hour standard RA to longer duration RA. The battery can support it.
Thanks, David. All right. Let's go ahead and go 2 slides forward. Okay, let's touch a little bit on the variable energy resource examples. So we're going to take a look at an example for a solar resource. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, wind and solar accounting rules and methodologies have changed at the CPUC, or are changing from effective load carrying capacity, ELCC, to exceedance profiles. And so that's at the CPUC, and that is thus changing the NQC, it's changing the QC that we receive from the CPUC, and but we're still receiving a single value for each resource from the CPUC. So just to review, the LCC, it's a probabilistic calculation to determine a perfect replacement capacity amount, whereas exceedance is a statistical value, and it's an indication of how much generation can be expected by a variable resource a certain amount of the time. So these profiles for these resource types have been released with in-depth differences for technology types and region from the CPUC. So you can take a look at those in their material. The key here for CAISO showings is that, and let's actually go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the key here is that the NQC for wind and solar will be based on the peak hour deliverable capacity based on the resource profile for that hour, which is what we receive from the CPUC. So it's a little bit complicated. We talked about this at the June workshop, but I just want to make sure we're clarifying here. So one note, in the previous slide, you'll see that the QC value for variable resources is the greater of either the gross peak hour or 0.1. So we cannot actually receive a 0 value. So in this example, let's go to the next slide, please. So you'll see here for this example that in hour 19, there is no value on the exceedance profile there. So we can't actually receive a 0 value, but at the bottom of this table, you'll see that the QC that we're going to receive is 0.1. So we worked with the CPUC to make sure that that is what we receive, and we're not receiving 0 values. The reason for this is that CAISO's SIRA software cannot receive a 0 for a QC value, So we've asked that a placeholder of 0.1 is provided instead. So let's go to the next slide, please. This just reiterates that example. So the showings process remains the same, but this is just a flag that some resources will be shown at 0 or may be represented at 0 in the 19th hour, but we will not be able to receive that value. And so that is what the value that the suppliers and LLCs should provide in our showings process. So I want to pause there and, oh, Catalin, I'll ask if you wanted to add anything else here, because I just want to make sure we've got this clear.
Yeah, it looks like we have a question, how did we decide to 0.1? So we wanted to be able to differentiate if you purchase 50% of a solar resource at 20% of a solar resource. So in order for our systems to, RA works with 2 decimal and only 2 decimal points. So, you know, if you gave us a 0.1 value, then we can differentiate. If somebody makes a showing 0.005, then we know it's 50% of that resource is RA, and the must offer obligation will be for 50% of that resource. So if at 11 a.m. the PMAX is 100, we know 50% of that 50 megawatts has a must offer obligation. So that's why what decided was 0.1, so we can differentiate for partial resources.
Thanks, Catalin. Yeah, Sybil, your question there about it is not a percent, it is 0.1 megawatts. So that is what will be received from the CPUC by the CAISO. So I'll pause here just to make sure we have that clear before we kind of move on to the wrap up here for the counting rules. So Perry, I see you have a question.
Hey, this is Perry Servideo, CISA. Along the lines of my earlier comment, I just wanted to be sure that this is clear. So today, I mean, this value, depending on the hour, you know, that you guys are evaluating, this value of whether it's 0 or 0.1 is because it's based on the exceedance, it's much lower than the value that you would typically get today. Have you included this in your example later on your CPM determinations?
We touch on this in a couple future slides for some of our processes, but
let's talk about it when we get.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it when we get to the CPM section, Perry.
Yeah.
Okay, and then, yeah. So, Catalin, I think just reading between the lines of what you were saying there, I think what you're saying is CAISO intends to essentially back these back out of its decision making, back the 0.1s back out, so that it's 0. It just was a software limitation.
That's correct.
Okay, yeah, because the 0.1s is 10%. I mean, that could add up to be a lot of a large.
It's not 10%, Perry. Perry, it's not 10%. It's 0.1 megawatts.
Got it.
The resource
Okay.
is
Yeah,
100
that
megawatts.
was the
0.1. Okay.
Okay, so that was the clarification you just made. No, that much is clear, but you know, having a large number of solar facilities, you could be into the 10s or 50s or even 100 megawatts here. I guess I didn't get the answer to the question. Is your intent to back this back out of any CPM decision making?
No.
You're going to count 0.1 megawatts.
That's right. We'll talk about it when we get to the CPM section, yes.
Okay. All right. I'll wait. Thanks, guys.
Right now, solar is counted at a much higher level than that.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a difference from how you would typically count. For purposes of making CPM decisions, things have changed. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Perry. Thanks, Simone. Okay, we have Mohan from Department of Water Resources.
I have a question on this slide. So since the CPUC is going to count as 0.1 megawatt for qualifying capacity, then for R8 cannot be shown above 0.1 megawatt. Is ISO going to make a change in its default counting criteria similar to this? I think
we haven't changed our default criteria right now. If we are changing the default criteria, it will go through the new stakeholder process along with other future changes. So at this point in time, there were no changes to the ISO default values. The default values are only used if the LRAs are not providing a rule. The PUC rules are rather clear, so that would not impact the ISO default rules.
Okay. And maybe, for clarification, are you referring to our default rules, or is there some other aspect? I mean, like to maybe level set from our earlier part of the conversation, we really are focused on 2025 implementation in the CAISO systems. The longer-term changes in terms of our program design and what needs to change in terms of our processes, program systems, will sort of continue on in our RA working group. I just want to make sure you're really just talking. Are you just really talking about our default?
Yeah, I think my question was going forward with these changes under SOD. Is ISO planning to make a change in default counting criteria for solar similar to this? That was my question.
Excellent question. Yeah, we're currently engaged in our RA working group effort around these, and there's sort of a number of different problem statements and work streams being worked out by the stakeholders, with the ISO and our independent facilitator. And this is sort of one of the topics that is being discussed currently in that venue, and will sort of continue to be discussed. So, yeah, I think that would be probably the right place to engage in those conversations.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, let's go to the next slide.
There was one more question in the chat.
Thank you, Christy. Let's, Kelly, did you have a question? You can go ahead.
That the 0.1 megawatt QC value is just for solar resources and not for any resource that doesn't appear in the peak hour.
I mean, potentially that could apply to demand response or wind. If their profiles were 0 at the peak hour.
Okay, so it's not just for solar, and I guess for batteries, this necessarily wouldn't apply because of what we were discussing earlier, that the CAISO will just receive the, the total NQC divided by the number of hours for that battery. So even if the battery doesn't appear in this peak hour, the CAISO won't receive the 0.1 megawatt QC value. They'll still receive the NQC divided by hours.
Right, the NQC for the storage won't change. It doesn't make a difference which hours you show it for on the slice of day show.
Okay, and so the 0.1 megawatt is for any other resource that doesn't appear in the peak hour, but does appear in that 24-hour profile.
Yeah, really, so what it applies to is the resources that have a 24-hour profile, which are the 3 I just said, solar, wind, and DR.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks for clarifying that, Simone.
And Kelly, this is Callan. Just maybe one more clarification to be clear. It doesn't matter what resources you're making a showing. The QC is established like a year before the showings are coming in, so it really makes no difference to where you are showing the resource. The QC will be established minimum a year ahead of time. It's just the PUC is letting you know what values they are using towards that to come up with that QC value. And there's not dependent on any LSC showings, period.
Great. All right. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a wrap up of what we just discussed, and I hope this doesn't cause more confusion than clarification, but I wanted to kind of compare how this example showing might fold into a showing at the ISO under our RA processes. So if you look at the resources shown here, on the next slide I have an example that shows how they would be shown to the ISO. And again, this is kind of a illustrative example, so it just ties together the things that we just went over. Next slide, please. So you'll just note that this represents the showing again at the ISO. So what we just discussed, the two batteries are shown to us at their 4-hour RA value, and then the wind was shown in hour 19, and it's an invisible gray slice, which is 0.1 megawatts for the solar. So I hope this is helpful. And this is kind of the end of our showings and counting rules section, and then we're going to go into the processes and programs at the ISO next. I'll just pause. We've got two questions from Noah and then Callie. Go ahead, Noah.
This is Noah Thom from Middle River Power. So this is the problem that Middle River kind of talked about in the last working group, which is if you note that your CEC forecast plus PRM line is 53 megawatts here, but in the slide before this, the sort of the optimization and so forth matches on a 24-hour basis to this line perfectly. And so in this case, here on your stack, essentially your stacking analysis, you have an abundance of resources because various resources, particularly like battery 2, is not being shown in the gross peak hour, net load peak hour. So how do in that sense, you either need to change the PRM specific back to an ISO only type of PRM, and I'm not talking about the default PRM here, but rather with the one for the program, to ensure that you have the right accounting of supply for the 0.1 LOE, or you're going to be thinking that you're super long.
Yeah.
Thanks, Noah.
So thanks. Yeah. So I mean, so the way that this works out, right, is that we're trying to get somewhere that we're not going to have major discrepancies between us and the PUC and the peak hour. We still need to see that battery 2 because it is part of the overall portfolio that's being shown to the CPUC, and we still need that resource under our RA rules. So that's just kind of the mechanics behind it. But I know, the planning reserve margin, we're not going to discuss that in detail here. That's still an open issue at the CPUC, and, comments are coming in on, what the PUC presented a couple weeks ago. So, we don't want to preclude where that's going to end up. And so, much prefer to defer that discussion for that venue.
If I were to add to that, Noah, I think at least your discussion topic, I think is one of the topics that we expected to arise up within that longer term framework and discussion items, and that we recognize that for 2025, that issues like this is, Christy discussed it well, but at least I didn't want to be dismissive of your comments. We recognize the fact that as we're making broader changes to our programs, things like this will need to be re-looked at, and so I appreciate your feedback. And obviously we're discussing, when you're discussing battery 2, you're really discussing, this case where there's a battery that's not shown for the peak hour, but is shown for some other period, which is, obviously a hypothetical example that we're coming up for illustrative purposes. Is this actually how they're going to be, resources going to be shown? What is the actual impact of this in terms of the impact to the grid? To me, it's an open-ended question. But thanks for bringing that up, Noah. I really appreciate it.
You said open-ended question. When are we going to end it?
Well, in the short term, this is Cattle. In the short term, I suggest you supply that in your comments to the CPUC because they are establishing the PRM.
Well, I think as well, Noah, there's a series of I think when you're asking about those broader reforms, there's obviously a prioritization effort that'll be going on as a part of that, and that we certainly appreciate your comments if you think this is that is a critical issue that needs to be focused on and has needed more near-term solutions on our end. I'd like to appreciate you putting that in the comments to us.
Yeah, I mean maybe. let me look. This thing's gonna sort of test your side. This thing's gonna go live in 2025. So if we don't have to write PRMs, and the ISO is thinking that it's super fine because the PRM from slice of day and whatever this is showing here, it is going to give a false sense of security. I think you need to rethink about priorities. Thanks.
Well, I know that so we do have a PRM for 2025 for decisions currently, right? So I think the exercises that we're going through, and again, this is live discussion at the PC. I don't want to get ahead of that, but I think we're trying to set PRMs now for 2026, 27 in the current RA proceedings. So I don't want to preclude what's going to come about as a result of discussions at the CPUC at this point.
Thanks, folks. That's a great question, Noah. And yeah, we look forward to discussing that in the working groups as well, kind of how our system works in alignment with slice of day in the long term. So, Callie, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. Apologies if you haven't gotten to this explicit slide, but somebody earlier also mentioned it, and I forget in which response to which question, but it was noted that all the resources shown on the CPUC slice a day will have to be shown to the CAISO. Now, I understand they'll be shown differently, obviously not in 24 hours, just one value to the CAISO. But I was curious if, when we're talking about an LSC that might have to go procure excess or additional RA capacity to meet the charging requirement so that it can show a storage resource on the CPUC slice a day paradigm to meet the slice a day requirements, does that other resource that was procured just to meet the charging requirement now have to also be shown to the CAISO, even if without that it meets the CAISO's requirement because it's the one value and it's just relying on that battery?
This is Kat, an idea. Any resource that you use in your RA plan should be shown to the ISO.
This is Jamie from the CPUC. Yes, the way that we validate the RA program for CPUC jurisdictional LSCs is with supply plans that come to the CAISO. So anything shown for slice of day needs to get validated with a supply plan.
Okay, so even if the resource was strictly procured so that it can meet the charging requirement in the slice a day paradigm, it now also has to be shown on the CAISO's RA showings.
It has to have a supply plan that validates the RA plan that's been provided to the CPUC.
At the CAISO.
Yeah, that's how we do it today.
Okay.
It's exactly how we do it today. Yeah.
Okay, and does that also apply if the storage resource is meeting the charging requirement from an energy-only co-located resource?
So, yeah, so I mean, the energy-only resources won't have NQC values at the CAISO, so, I mean, those just wouldn't count in CAISO's RA processes as not being RA qualified. But
I'm not sure that's for Abdul. This is Catalin. Can somebody put a resource at the 0 value in their supply plan? Is that going to come through?
They can. It's just going to be 0 RA. That's not going to. It's going to count as 0 RA. I think what the key thing is, Christy's correct that if it's an energy only, it's not going to. It's going to be 0 NQC. So it's not going to have NQC actually. So it's not going to be. It can be shown. But if the NQC is 0, let's say, then the NQC minimum is 0.01 actually. So if it's an energy only, cannot be shown to the CAISO. And Kelly, to answer, I think, all of your questions together, we're not changing the rules today that we have. If you basically, we don't force anyone to show us anything. There's no have to show this. There's no such thing. And LSCs have an obligation to meet. To meet the obligation, they need to show us sufficient RA capacity. That's it. How much they show us from which resource, it's up to the LSCs and the agreements they sign with the suppliers. That's how it works today. That's how it's going to work next year. The only thing that's changing from CAISO or impacting the CAISO's process here, or the main thing I would say, is the counting rules and therefore how much NQC you can show. But the fact of the matter is not changing that you can show us up to NQC only, and and by you, the LSCs and the suppliers, decide how much to show the CAISO to meet the LSC's obligation. That is the target. We're not forcing anyone to do anything, not today and not tomorrow. Anything meaning how much they show us. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but I'm trying to reconcile with what you just said, which makes sense with what an answer was earlier to my question, which was if a resource is shown in off-peak hours on the slice of day, strictly so it can meet the charging requirement of a standalone resource, and it's really just a standalone resource that's needed to meet the CAISO requirement. So really, the question is, does now that LLC have an obligation to show the other resource? What I heard earlier was yes. What I'm hearing now is maybe no. So I just think it's a nuance that I think because there's like an LLC might have to procure extra capacity just so it can show a battery on the slice of day showings. It's just something that I guess we'll ask you guys to think through, and we'll think through it too. But it sounds like maybe if that is the case, that maybe there is a rule change within that somewhere, but it was something that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, Kylie. I was going to say the reason you heard two answers is because you heard it from two different entities. I think the previous one from Jamie, PUC, and then what you just heard from me at the CAISO. So I think because we're fortunate to have a PUC with us to answer some of the questions because it's a lot. Really, the main changes are on their side. So if there is a PUC requirement for you to show even a resource that's charging, that's a PUC requirement. But like I said, CAISO's perspective, we're not forcing you to do that. If the LSC met its obligation and it doesn't want to show everything it contracted, that's an option for them today, and that it continues to be an option for them tomorrow, unless rules changes in the working groups. So we're opening everything for discussion in these RA working groups, the modeling and process changes. So if you have feedback, ideas, that's where we want to rethink the whole process. But for the purpose of today's discussion, which is alignment of CAISO's process and slice of day for next year, and at least in the near term, that we're not changing the existing process of not forcing people to show everything they contracted.
Okay, then maybe it would be useful to, I think on one of your guys' slides, and I apologize, I don't have the slide number right in front of me, where it says anything shown on the slice a day has to be shown to the CAISO, then maybe just adding some clarification around that to specifically address that scenario where we kind of did get two different answers and we're just trying to understand exactly what has to be shown to the CAISO would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I think we'll follow up on this, definitely. Appreciate your question. And thanks, Jamie, for clarifying there, too. So, all right. Let's take the three questions we have and then move on. Let's start with Steve from SEE.
Keen from Southern California Edison. I just want to follow on to Noah's comments. And when you look at this, yes, we're counting that storage here that maybe wasn't shown in that particular hour, but comparing this to the way things are done today, you're also not showing any of the solar, which would have been counted to some extent. And this is one of the things that we've emphasized in our comments in the working group, is that CAISO does need to think through the implication for these changed values that they're going to get, for what it means for reliability and how it's going to impact CPM. And we're especially interested in making sure so that, if the CPUC entity is considered compliant based on the showing to the CPUC, that doesn't trigger backstop from the CAISO. So it's kind of, I view there as being two important parts that need to be considered, and this will need to be done very soon because people are going to start trying to buy their resources for 2025 soon. On the one hand, you need to make sure that, as Noah was talking about, that the planning reserve margin you're using makes sense, that the implications for reliability are the same as you're expecting. And that may change. But the other thing is making sure that it's synced up with the CPUC showings so that you know, we're not in danger of being subject to backstop procurement when we're actually sufficient on the CPUC showings. Again, this is, I think, one of the things, yeah, this just needs to be like one of the things that gets started right away in the working group.
Definitely.
The answers need to come out very soon.
So just want to make sure that people understand there are two distinct questions here. One, is the ISO look at the reliability? Yes, we'll look at that. The other one is, you know, just because you're passing the CPUC RA test, that never meant that you are okay at the ISO. And, you know, just because you're passing an LRA's RA program, it doesn't mean the same thing into the ISO program. So those were never equivalent, and they still might not be equivalent now. Okay, so that's a totally different question, and it's not the same question. The question we are looking into is the reliability question. The other question, yes, there are some differences, and there have been differences there since 2005, and the differences are still moving forward. So you cannot, an LRA cannot waive the ISO backstop procurement rule because they met a requirement under the LRA's rules.
No.
That was clear. Okay, good.
I understand that, but I am, you know, in general, it's the case that if you're sufficient on the LRA, you're sufficient for you as well. And, you know, I think that's been what people have been trying to do. If there's going to be a big change in that, LSEs need to be made aware of that so that they can deal with the two different sets of rules.
We looked at that, and we believe that's still true. We can look again, but we believe that is still to be true.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. All right, let's go to Chris and then Mary.
Hi there. This is Chris Devin with TerraGen. Can you hear me?
We can, Chris.
Okay. I got a couple questions. I'll try to keep it quick. First one would be, I think for the CPUC, I just want to confirm my understanding of how the storage showings and countings will be transferred to CAISO. So the simple example that I want to pose is a 1 hour duration storage resource that is, let's say, a 10 megawatt resource with 10 megawatt hours shown on a CPUC plan for 1 single hour. My understanding is that can be shown for up to 10 megawatts in that single hour. Is the 4 hour duration rule going to be applied and cap that for what is transferred to the CAISO so that it's only shown as a 2.5 megawatt NQC resource to the CAISO?
Yes. That's how,
okay.
The NQC will still be based on 4 hours.
Okay, so the NQC, so the QC at the PUC can be 10 megawatts and shown for 1 hour for 10 megawatts, but at CAISO it's only going to be counted for 2.5 megawatts.
On the ISO showing that the NQC the QC will come from the PUC. If it's deliverable resource, it will be NQC, it will be 2.5. So when you make a showing at the ISO, you will be making vis-a-vis the 2.5. If you've been fully procured, then you should enter 2.5, and you would have a must-offer obligation for 24 hours for the entire resource, whatever your resource is good for.
Thank you, Catalin. That makes a lot of sense to me, exactly what you just said. I would just like to point this back to the CPUC and show that this QC convention that would allow this to be shown for 10 megawatts, I think there needs to be some cap that is either described, and I just don't understand how the NQC list is going to work essentially in this situation. Because if a 10 megawatt 1 hour battery can be shown for up to 10 megawatts of RA as the LSC showing at the CPUC, I believe that would require them to say this is a 10 megawatt QC value resource. And then the CAISO is going to have to cap that at 2.5, or the CPUC is just going to do its own cap and transfer it to the CAISO. I think that dynamic needs to be laid out here, because if the CPUC doesn't cap that and send the proper number to the CAISO, so the CAISO can, put it on the NQC list as 2.5, I think there's going to be a bit of somewhat of a conflict there, potentially.
I mean, the batteries could be shown flexibly to CPUC. This particular battery you're talking about, it could be shown for 1 hour, for 10 megawatts, it can be shown for 2 hours, for 5 megawatts, it can be shown for 4 hours, for 2.5 megawatts. But
right,
the number that is the NQC value, which is what will be compared to the values that are sent to the CAISO, is the NQC value, which is based on the 4 hour value. So it will match.
Okay. I just want to point out that this does present some challenges as far as contracting goes, because there's going to be a list that says 2.5 megawatt NQC for that resource, and then it can be shown for 10 megawatts at the CPUC. And I think that, there's going to be some translations that need to happen that I think people will be arguing about and maybe in the contracting, but that maybe be just the result of these regulatory changes.
I mean, we still do require that a resource be able to dispatch for 4 hours. That's why the overall value is based on, the 4 hour value.
Yeah, I just
with the optimization tool, there's a million ways it can show up in the slice of day showing, but that doesn't change what the actual resource is.
I understand. And so I guess I would just pose this, that, it seems to me that there's a bit of an issue or concern that there's going to be, some kind of a QC list that says this could be shown up to 10 megawatts, but then the CAISO is going to have another list that says it's capped at 2.5. And, historically, a lot of people have contracted around this 2.5 type of a 4 hour duration, megawatt NQC list number. And so, we don't have to solve this right now, but I just point that out, that just maybe we need to think a little bit more about, QC list versus NQC list and how this works under slice a day versus the CPC versus CAISO lists that are being used here. So thanks for hearing me out on that one. I'll move on real quick. Oh, Jamie has your hand up. If you want to respond, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Chris, I have a question for you. So today, when you sign a contract with an LSC, are you signing it for megawatt hours? Because I know that the way that we structured this in the decision, a really key importance was to keep it kind of a bundled product across the month. And the way that we're implementing it is that, continuous megawatt hour limit. And so I'm just wondering how it's being contracted in terms of, the monthly product and that month megawatt hour, amount.
There's a lot of different ways that it's done. There can be some that are, just simple, the Pmax of the unit and the megawatt hours, or it could be contracted for a set NQC value. I think the way that the contracting is done may reflect the counting rules in different ways.
Well, the QC is tied to that megawatt hour, category that's being pulled from, the master file data. And so I'm just struggling.
Okay, so that means that the QC should be capped at 2.5 in this scenario, and shouldn't be allowed to be shown for 10 megawatts. You see how this is confusing?
Well, but it's you're allowed underneath the slice a day, because we're taking that 2.5 and we're saying, okay, now you have a 24-hour requirement. Show your resource, to meet this 24-hour requirement. It's a bundled requirement. I see what you're you know, which you're bringing up, which is an LSE can show all of that amount in 1 hour, but it's the same megawatt amount that, you know, has been contracted for, megawatt hour amount that's been contracted for that month, for that product, right? It's a monthly product. It's bundled, which is the,
Yeah, I just want to make sure that the QC list and the NQC list make sense. So I think, you know, let me think about this more, but I appreciate your response, but I think there is maybe some concern here in my mind. But the other question I had that I want to, I'll try to go quickly.
There won't be any change to the NQC list at all.
So the NQC list would still say 2.5 on that, right? So yeah, okay. It's just as simply on the LSE side that they could show more than what the NQC is. So we'll just have two different kind of compliance paradigms to think about, I think, in my mind.
Yeah, and you know, then it would only be for that 1 hour. So, you know, like the megawatt hour total over the day shouldn't change. It would it's just, you know, that
Got it. Yeah, and the MOO wouldn't change. It would still be only a 2.5 megawatt must offer obligation, right?
And
so
Simone,
this
can
gets,
you? Sorry, Chris.
I was just going to say this just. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to maybe make sure that I was fully understanding the kind of interconnection limit aspect in relation to this 1 hour showing. So maybe Simone, can you kind of confirm how the interconnection kind of limits the resource and being shown for that full?
I mean, this is sort of what Catalin was talking about earlier. I mean, what you're assuming here, Chris, is that this battery can actually dispatch 10 megawatts, right? Not 2.5. So if the PMAX is only 2.5, then you can't show it for 10 in 1 hour. It would depend.
Right, but
so
there are folks that build 10 megawatt interconnections and do a 1 hour battery. We have those. So I mean, it's not as simple as just saying that those don't exist and that they're capped at 2.5.
No, yes, we're just clarifying that, you know, in that case, yes, it's fine. But it is only for 1 hour. The LSE still needs to get something else for the 23 hours, or they could spread it over more hours and, you know, spread other things over more hours as well. It's, you know, they have that flexibility.
Okay, so imagine a scenario where the LSC, you know, doesn't have enough to meet the single hour in one of the CPUC showings because you know it hasn't contracted enough. But
sorry, Chris, you cut out.
Duration.
Can you start over?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. So it just seems to me that this difference in the QC values and the way that this slice a day is being applied is going to potentially result in a case where the LSC doesn't look like it's sufficient to the CPUC, but the CAISO sees that it has enough resources. So I think this is more of a CPM discussion. We can talk about it later, but I just point that piece of this out. The other question that I had is on the PRM piece, or just the point on the PRM piece. Just really quickly, and then I'll wrap it up, I promise.
Thanks.
Yeah, I know that we're going over here, so thank you for letting me get to this. But the point that was raised earlier that Christy was responding to about the PRMs and accounting rules and all these things for the solar piece is a bit concerning to me, and I think we do need to talk about it. And I realize that the PRM is being discussed at the CPUC, but PRM is really a function of counting rules. And so if the CPUC sets the 2025 RA PRM at 17%, and then the CAISO is using 0.1 megawatts for solar, instead of the ELCC values for it in these validations, it's going to look like the CAISO is far shorter on capacity than what they were previously. So that point needs to be accounted for in these discussions and considered carefully in at both the CPUC and at CAISO, because I don't think it's as simple as just continuing to apply the counting rules and the same PRM, or else we're going to get into a real scarcity condition potentially and just, you know, have negative results on the pricing for RA and other things that could happen that would be, I think, very unfortunate. So I really do stress that PRM is a function of counting rules. And if we leave one how it has been done previously and change the other, that's going to have pretty drastic impacts. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we'll note that for future discussions. And I think I'm going to ask that we move on from here. I see some folks have questions still, but I just want to make sure we get through some of the CAISO process elements. So next slide, please. And thank you, Jamie and Simone, again for chiming in there. We appreciate it. All right, so to run through some of these processes, and this will address some of the questions from earlier. Next slide, please. So we have an overview here of how NQCs are determined at the ISO. So as it stands today, the CPUC will continue to provide a single monthly QC value for resources to the California ISO. And so there's this highlight we were just discussing, that there will be a change with variable energy resources due to the change in methodology for counting those at the CPUC, and touching again on what we discussed earlier about the QC will be either the greater of the gross peak hour value or 0.1 megawatts. And of course, those resources still have their must offer obligation, notwithstanding that 0.1 showing value. So I will clarify also that that is being provided to us by the CPUC. There's some language in the decision from the CPUC about that, and we've been working with them to make sure that is the case. So this third bullet here is just kind of an overview of the reasons why the ISO might cut QC values that we receive from LRAs to produce the NQC values. So the first one is a given. If a QC can be reduced based on the Pmax of the resource or based on the interconnection. This second reason is not used right now, but it is existent in our tariff. And then the last item is deliverability. Many folks have familiar with, and that's based on transmission constraints during stress system conditions. And then just highlighting there again at the bottom that suppliers and LSEs should continue to show up to that NQC value that is given based on these criteria. Next slide, please. All right, so to touch a little bit more on deliverability, so the purpose of deliverability is to make sure that the transmission system can reasonably ensure that RA capacity can be delivered to load during stress system conditions, like I mentioned before. So this is based on the highest load and most stress system condition hour that this status is determined by the ISO. So resources will either be assigned fully deliverable, so that's FCDS, full capacity deliverability status. They may be deemed partially deliverable and reduced by a percentage, or they may not receive deliverability status. And again, that study is done based on highest load conditions. I will add that off-peak hours are not considered in our deliverability studies because, again, that is not highest system conditions. So even though there are 24 hours shown at the CPUC, our deliverability studies only correspond to that highest system need. So we have one more slide on deliverability. Next slide, please. So if a resource is fully deliverable, it does count for resource adequacy based on the QC value established by the CPUC or other LRAs. Again, the energy for that resource might be shown during other hours, but as we saw in our showings example, this deliverability just affects the showings at the ISO. So, and again, a resource might be partially deliverable and only can count for resource adequacy up to that amount, which is shown in the NQC value. And that is a cut that takes place across the entire year, across 12 months of showings. And finally, just to clarify, energy-only resources that do not have deliverability status do not count for resource adequacy. So we did discuss that earlier. I'm going to pause there before we go to showings and ask Catalin if you have anything to add there. All right. So next slide, please. So I have a brief slide here on maximum import capability. So this is how the ISO studies deliverability for imported resources into our BAA. And this process to determine maximum import capability, it represents a quantity of megawatts determined by the ISO to be, again, simultaneously deliverable to the aggregate of the BAA load. And this is another test performed to make sure that RA resources can perform during highest system need. And this capability is assigned to load serving entities, and their imported RA showings for those LSEs are limited for each intertie for imports to the share of MIC received by the LSE. And that calculation is done in an annual study at the ISO and allocated annually as well. I want to highlight here that we talked about the 0.1 megawatt value for some variable energy resources. If that is an imported resource and it is resource specific, it should still be matched with the requisite amount of MIC value, so it would have to be 0.1 for that resource. And then finally, I'll just add that this is an overview of deliverability. Obviously, it is a complex subject, but there is a stakeholder process taking place right now on the ISO's deliverability methodology and the technical aspects of that. And so we are moving, there's a draft straw proposal, and that recommends doing away with the secondary system need and only determining deliverability based on highest system need. So again, that's in the materials for the deliverability methodology stakeholder process. I recommend, if you're interested in learning more about that, please take a look at those materials. Next slide, please. All right, so this is kind of a recap of our examples, but for showings of RA, we went over the changes or lack thereof of different resource types earlier. So generally showings, there's no change from previous years in the sense that suppliers and LSEs should show up to the NQC value of each resource. And if there's a partially contracted resource, participants should show the contracted amount. And of course, the multiple contracts cannot exceed the NQC value. And then for imports, again, that shown RA must be paired with MIC. So I think this is, again, kind of a summary. The details were discussed earlier. And then let's touch briefly on our system and local RA assessments. Next slide, please. So we're going to go over this more at our next working group meeting in detail, but I just wanted to provide a quick rundown on how system and flex RA requirements are met based on under CPUC slice of day rules. So RA shown by LCs and suppliers will continue to be compared to coincident peak demand plus the LRA's provided PRMs. So again, the CPUC has provided a 2024 PRM, and that's how we determine how each LSE meets their share of system resource adequacy requirements. And then we compare the showings from that process based on what we discussed earlier with those aggregate system RA requirements determined by the 1 and 2 forecasts plus the PRMs. And for flex resource adequacy, it's a similar process comparing showings to aggregate flex RA requirements. So to summarize, except for what we discussed before, as far as showings, there's no slice of day implication here. And we'll continue to perform this process as we have. Next slide, please. All right, and then again, briefly on local resource adequacy requirements. This should not be implicated by slice of day, but local RA will continue to be shown and compared to the assigned local allocation through the local study process, and the CPUC does reassign their LSEs a total local allocation among their jurisdictional LSEs to determine whether each load-serving entity has met their share of local RA requirements. And then after that, so shown local RA resources are dispatched in technical studies based on their expected output at the time of that peak for that local area. And this determines whether local requirements are met. So that's a process done by the ISO. And if that is not met, then there may be a backstop procurement issued. So that's just status quo, how things work today. And then there's a little bit of a nuance here as far as local CPM procurement. And so depending on how the process above works, which I mentioned, the short amount is first allocated to LSEs if they're short individually, and then if there's a remaining short amount, that is allocated to the collective load share base. So, Catalin, did I leave anything off there that you'd like to highlight? All right. Excellent. And then we have kind of a group of processes here: CPM, must-offer obligation, and substitution requirements. And those, the bottom line is that there's no change under slice of day. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So again, CPM processes and requirements continue to be based on shown RA up to that NQC value, which we discussed previously. I'm just going to kind of run through these because these slides are brief. Next slide, please. The same goes for our substitution requirements at the ISO. This is based on shown RA with the nuances that we discussed earlier. Next slide, please. And same goes for our bid insertion and RAIM processes. So that concludes our sort of a high-level overview of the ISO's RA processes, and just clarified a few things with regards to slice of day. So we're getting close to the top of the hour here, and I think there's room for more discussion. We can take a couple of quick questions, I think, to wrap up, and then I'll just reserve a few minutes to go over next steps and kind of how we'd like to dive further into some of these topics in future working group meetings. So we may go a little bit over, but I'm going to try to get us out of here about 10 after the hour. Okay, I'm going to take a look at the chat quickly here, because I know that participants. It looks like we mostly got comments in the chat. Those are helpful. We'll note those down and take a look at those and see if we need to follow up on those. And then as far as hands raised, I know I skipped a few people earlier, so Mary, go for it.
Hi, Mary Neal from ARM. So I just wanted to verify the PRM again because I got a little lost in that section. So right now the CPUC basically has two PRMs. We have the non-slice PRM and then the slice PRM. So for 2024, CAISO is going to use non-slice, and then 2025 we're going to move to the slice one. Is that what's happening?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I can clarify, and Simone and Jamie, feel free to jump in as well. But in 2024, we're not moving to slice of day yet. It's still test year, so the RA program is as is, status quo. So, this conversation is kind of anticipation of when slice of day goes live, which would be 2025. But as I mentioned, there is a decision. The PUC does have a decision that sets the PRM for 2025 already, and the current RA rulemaking is looking at 26, 27. So I hope that helps to clarify, but yeah, this is not a framework that we're doing next year. Just want to be clear about that.
So that sounds like it's not necessarily known whether the slice of day PRM will be used by the CAISO or not. Is that fair?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, on our current tariff, you know, the PRM is set by the LRA.
We're using the PRM that's coming from the CPUC.
Well, CPUC has two. So how do we get around this?
Yeah,
Jamie?
hi, Mary. Mary, just to
Go ahead,
clarify.
Jamie. Yeah.
Yeah. So the PRM for 2024 RA compliance is a 17% planning reserve margin. And we're still using ELCC and regular accounting rules for 2024. And so the slice a day PRM will become effective beginning in 2025. And I think that it's a little unclear to me and probably to others how we're going to translate the existing 17% planning reserve margin to that slice of day PRM. So I think more discussion needs to be done and processed in the RA proceeding on this topic. But to be clear, Mary, nothing's changing for 2024. The slice of day PRM needs to be, you know, further refined, I think, in my mind, for 2025.
Okay, so TBD on that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and we will be in the CPUC's process. You know, we will be issuing another workbook. I think there was informal comments that were solicited in our proceeding, and the comment deadline was extended. And we do plan on later this month publishing another workbook and having more process. So definitely more discussion around it.
Thanks, Jamie. And thank you, Mary. Let's go to Steve from SoCal Edison.
Hi, this is Steve Keen from Southern California. And this question is concerning the MIC, and it's not really related to slice a day. It's related to the TSMSP that was just approved by FERC. And if an entity comes in and they have MIC and they try in the month ahead process to include an import resource, but in the meantime that there's been enough ATC given away through the TSMSP process. I guess my questions are, I have a couple different questions. What I understood from the TSMSP process is that resource would count as RA, but that could be curtailed in real time. The question is, how is that going to count towards your calculation of reliability and whether you need to backstop resources?
Yeah, so basically you do require a MIC in order to count for RA. If you have MIC, whatever resource you're bringing from outside, it will count for RA, regardless of the wheel priority reservation process. So now once we go into the real-time months, if there was maybe, you're asking if there was too much wheels given out, and now the new showings with MIC, the two of them might not fit on an intertie. It looks like there might be congestion on that intertie. There might or there might not be, because the resources that RA have a must offer obligation, they have a bid obligation. They might not necessarily actually win in the bid, so we actually might not see a congestion on that intertie. We might or might not see a congestion on that intertie in real time. If there is a congestion on that intertie, then yes, there is something to need to be done about the congestion on that intertie. But many things need to happen from the showings all the way to real time for that actually to happen. And it's not sure it will happen. It's not automatic that if you have the two higher than the limit, that automatically we will have a need to curtail. But it's a higher probability that we have a need to curtail. When we do the RA backstop, the CPM only looks at the values that are provided in the RA program. So we still continue to look at the values provided in the RA program. Beyond that, what's required for ED CPM, it's totally different. So that goes beyond what is a planning reserve margin requirement. That's something they see in real time, and that has a multitude of factors. Would this exacerbate those factors? Maybe this will slightly exacerbate those factors, but there are many other factors why they need to do a ED CPM in real time, and this should most likely not have a significant impact on that. That remains to be seen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Catalin. I'm going to jump to Doug, just because you had your hand up from earlier, Doug.
Yeah, I think, so I'm back on, I guess one of the topics to take up in future is how CPM determinations are going to be made, because that's a separate modeling process than what you get from the CPUC is my understanding. And so presumably if the CPUC modeling is pretty accurate, then you'll get a list of values, you'll get a PRM from the CPUC, and those resources that satisfy the PRM should be enough to run the system, which means the independent CPM modeling should come up with the same answer and we should be okay. But I think that's right, but it might be nice to discuss that in a future workshop. And I guess one of the other things that, given the earlier discussion, that I wanted to point out about the slice of data PRM, I mean, Noah is correct that, of course, the CPM depends on accounting conventions, but at the end of the day, those CPMs that are coming from the CPUC are all determined by what is adequate to hit that 0.1 LOLE. So I don't really necessarily see that as being implicating a reliability concern, because if all the modeling is accurate, and of course modeling is always inaccurate, it's just a question of how inaccurate, it should result in a planning reserve margin that's appropriate for the accounting conventions and the QC values that you're getting. And I guess the third question, just as a clarifying, very high-level gloss, I think this is right, that if we file our slice of day showing in 2025 and beyond, and it's adequate, for the hour ending 19 or whenever that gross peak is, we should pretty much be good on the CAISO side, because our stack of resources in hour ending 19 has met the PRM requirement that the CPUC is giving you. So those two should be similar, except that we might have additional resources that are like batteries that we're using in hours other than hour ending 18 or 19, or the peak hour, that would also count. So we might actually end up pretty long, just because we've got batteries that are we're not counting to dispatch in that hour. Does that sound approximately like I'm not wildly off, I guess is the question. I'm looking for reassurance here that my understanding is correct. So that,
yeah. This is Catalin. This is Catalin. You are not wildly off. Just to go quickly through some of the questions that you had. Right now, there is no change to the CPM backstop, and there is no change to the tariff authority. Any future change to the CPM authority or different studies or different processes to be done for that will have to go through the stakeholder process that we have initiated, and it will be discussed and ranked among changes that need to be done in the future. But today there will be no changes immediately once the change is it's over. There is no change to the current process, and we do tend to agree with you that based on the rules that we see today, if you do meet the hour at the CPUC, you will be able to meet the ISO's requirements as well. We do also acknowledge that we need to see all the resources that are used in the RA program, because we need to have a must offer obligation across the 24 hours, and that number that's provided to us need to include all those resources that were used in order to meet the RA 24-hour requirements at the PUC. So, but generally we agree with you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks, Doug. We'll note some of those comments that you mentioned earlier as well. So, okay, I think we'll wrap up shortly, but let's go to Perry and then Noah.
Hey, this is Perry Servideo, CISA again. I was really hoping for more on that CPM slide. What I wanted to at least put out there is that what's clear after today's call is that CAISO's input information will change under slice of day. What's not clear to me yet is what impact this has on CAISO's compliance and backstop procurement decisions. I'd say that we're concerned first about alignment between CPUC compliance as well as CAISO tariff compliance. And second, we're concerned about what impact this new input information has on CAISO's CPM decisions as it compares to status quo and as it compares to what the CPUC would think is short or long, because I imagine that they will keep their opportunity to waiver any short decisions that the CAISO may make. So all of that being said, I think that the 2024 test year would provide a great opportunity for CAISO to evaluate these impacts and report back to stakeholders on that. And just a few of the things that we talked about before. I know we're over time, and you probably don't want to get to the end of the examples now, but the input data that's changing is today you base a CPM decision on a wind and solar ELCC value rather than the gross peak exceedance value. It's easy enough to say, oh, one's less than the other, maybe we CPM more. It's another thing to show for each of the test months this year what CAISO's calculation would have been status quo, what CAISO's calculation would be under the new rules, and compare that to the CPUC's calculation of how long or short we are based on the 6 different types of CPMs that can occur. The other point is this decision really a technology-driven decision to use a 0.1 megawatt value where perhaps the value should otherwise be 0. And it'd be good to know what impact that has also on the compliance at CAISO versus compliance at CPUC, as well as what impact that has on the backstop decision. It's too simple, I think, to say that 0.1 megawatts is small when a fleet of 200 solar plants would make that a 20 megawatt overage. I think that could highlight whether you need to think about a way to back out those 0.1 megawatts that are essentially not qualified based on the CPUC decisions in determining how much you need to procure and backstop capacity. That's all. There's no real question there. I just hope you'll consider those comments. Thank you.
And I just want to point out too that, the 0 megawatt issue, you really only see this impacting the solar resources, and it's not across all months. So I think even if you look at September in the files that the PUC put out, there are non-zero numbers in hour 19, for example. So, this would only impact some of the winter months. So I just want to put that into perspective too. But anything else?
No, the only thing I wanted to say is that I know, Perry, you want to talk about all kind of CPMs, but really the QC value is only used in the system CPM, pretty much. All the other ones are not used for. And we do compare the QC values that we receive versus the PRM that we receive. So, as we talked before, the more discussion there, but the QC values and the counting values do go hand in hand with the PRM. So, the two of them, we do compare how much we're getting versus what the PRM was established by that LRA. So when you change one, the other one will probably change. accordingly. So we expect that to come out in the next proceedings here.
Right. So just back to my point, there's a lot to unpack in what you just said there. There's what the tariff, I call it the tariff gatekeeper to whether or not you can CPM under the various CPMs that you do. And then there's secondary, the decision of CAISO of whether or not it will and the megawatt quantity that it will CPM. What would help in that conversation is to get some kind of short description in a paper in this proceeding where CAISO could walk through both of, or at least walk through, I'd say, their decision making between, it comes after the point in which the tariff allows CAISO to make that decision, because the input information into that decision is now different.
Thank you. We'll take that on the advisement.
Thanks, Barry. All right, let's just take one more question from Noah, and then I'll provide next steps here.
Hey, this is Noah Tom from Middleware Power. So I support what Perry just said. This is mainly a question for Jamie and Simone. You know, to the extent that in 2025 there is a PRM for sort of the ISO program here, because they're not going into slice of day aspects, generally speaking. Is the intent for potentially the next OIR to sort of look at what that PRM value is expected for 2025, or are we going to use the value that was set for 2025, which is 17%? Because we're certainly, it does not seem like we should be using the slice of day PRM in the ISO's sort of validation process.
Hi, Noah, this is Jamie. I'm trying to wrap didn't get all of that. Can you rephrase your question? From what I understood, you're asking is the 17% for 2025 correct? And then you had a question about what should be used in CAISO's process. So just help me. Sorry.
Yeah, essentially, that's correct. So essentially, the ISO is not making any changes, not using slice of day planning or a program. It's only using sort of updated QC values. And so the PRM that was established or adopted in the last RA decision said 2024 and 2025 PRM value, it will be using 17%, but then go ahead and do a conversion to which you guys, Energy Division, has provided sort of a sample of for 2024. So I'm just trying to wonder or understand, because the QC values are changing, do you think the 17% is still applicable for which the ISO to use when it goes into 2025?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a good question. So yes, the RA decision did adopt a 17% planning reserve margin for 2024 and 2025. It also said that the slice of day calibration tool, shall be published by Energy Division, using the LOLE study results to calibrate that PRM. So when you set a 17% amount that's not based on the results of that LOLE study, it gets challenging to convert, right? How do you convert that to a slice a day PRM? So I think that's what I was raising earlier. So yeah, I think, in my mind, I think this topic needs to be discussed in the current RA proceeding. How and if we can convert a 17% PRM to slice of day with the tool, or if there needs to be something modified about that. That's my opinion about this.
Understand. I think
well, let me just ask you on the CAISO front. Like, CAISO will take, or is, and my understanding of CAISO's tariff is they take the PRM that's given to them by the LRA. So if we change that 17%, they'll take what we change it to. So we provide them that as an input into CIRA, and the other LRAs do the same.
Understand. Thank you for that explanation. I think I'll go back to the point earlier, which was under slice of day and the way the ISO does its stacking analysis. The ISO stacking different resources that are being shown for different hours, and therefore it's like an apples to oranges type of stacking to get to the reliability requirements. However, the PUC is using slightly different. It's actually using on an hourly basis with an hourly with a PRM that's applicable, for those particular apples and not oranges. And so, sorry, just unfortunately butchering the analogy here. I think we need to ensure that we have the right type of program and inputs such that both sides of the equation here can ensure reliability. And I would be concerned to be using a slice of day PRM that's converted from the 17% or whatever from the LLE study into the ISO program here, because they're not comparable.
All right, Noah. Well, thanks for your input, and I think we should just discuss more in the CPU in this topic in the CPUC's process.
Yeah, so for purposes of setting that particular PRM, I agree. I think for what the ISO ought to be using, I think this belongs in this particular proceeding. Initiative process. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. We'll make a note of that. And thanks, Jamie. All right, let's just quickly touch on next steps. Next slide, please. Thanks, everybody, for bearing with us here. This discussion is super important. Want to make sure we get the input and questions that folks have. So, as you know, we're in the midst of a working group process for our resource adequacy modeling and program design. So we have our next working group meeting coming up soon. Next slide, please. So just to summarize here, we are not making any system or process changes in advance of the 2025 RA year. We are hearing your comments and questions today, and we can discuss some of those further in depth for future years. We clarified our processes and how those function under slice of day, but we will continue those discussions during the working group process. We anticipate the 2024 slice of day test year results coming early next year, and we will be reviewing those results to make sure that we understand what the test year showing process is telling stakeholders. And then next slide, please. Next slide, please. We covered that. Next slide, one more. Okay, so I don't have a date on here, but I can share with you that on our website there is now a December 6th working group date. There was a meeting on the 17th of this month that is no longer happening. So please join us on the 6th. And we know that folks are putting comments together for our meeting that happened last Wednesday. That deadline has been extended to Monday the 20th of November. And then as far as comments on this meeting, because we want to make sure we captured everything, and for folks who didn't get a chance to comment or ask their questions, the comment template will be posted shortly, and we'll have that open until Thursday, November 30th. So hopefully give you enough time there to get your comments in and put that together. And then we'll be continuing working groups after that on January 16th. And that is our last slide. Thank you again, everyone. And thanks again to the CPUC and to my team here at the ISO for...
Maybe, one other, this part there from the ISO. Please. One other quick comment. I saw it in the chat, so at least I wanted to say, there's some desire. Obviously, what we heard in the working group was that this is like a very high priority topic for folks. We spent 2 hours here really as kind of a level setting discussion. Please put in your comments, there was a comment earlier by a participant saying they wanted examples we certainly appreciate that type of thing as well. There's specific examples or challenges that you're still facing. You know, we're happy to have more of these, even in the working group meetings or in a one-off meeting, sort of further discussion on this topic. So thanks, Ansel, for that. Apologize for butting in. Before I wrapped up, I wanted to make sure that because there's a number of people in the chat who had that comment, I wanted to offer that venue too.
Thank you. That's helpful. No, that's great. And that's all from me. So thank you again, Caitlin, and to our participants for helpful discussion here.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.